Hey everyone, welcome back. My name is Mac, and today we're talking about how Midnight is exposing Elemental Shaman's biggest weakness. The first Midnight raid logs are in, and Elemental Shaman is absolutely in the dirt. This is probably confusing for a lot of people, given that if you looked at any pre-raid discussions, tier lists, or anything like that, the spec looked generally solid, usually landing somewhere around mid to high A tier. Because of this, a lot of people chose it as a relatively safer spec given the sims. But naturally, when these first logs dropped and we see Elemental down in the dirt where it ended up, people start to panic. Which makes sense, because realistically, on paper, all signs pointed to Elemental being a top tier pick, but even still, I don't necessarily think it's time to completely freak out yet, although I am a little bit worried. Anyways, what happened? Ultimately, I think it's a compounding 3-tiered problem between low gear, Elemental's damage profile, and just the general raid composition. But before we get into Elemental specifically, I think the first thing we have to talk about is the raid, because it's just asking for a really awkward kind of damage profile that Elemental's not good at. A lot of these fights are built around infrequent adds and spread cleave. The ad waves are kind of rough because while you think we have innate AoE, we really don't have good answers for it given that most of it's tied to Earthquake. The ads just aren't living long enough for us to get the full value out of our AoE kit. But at the same time, those ads are alive long enough for other more bursty upfront specs to get meaningful value out of their cleave and pad those moments way harder than Elemental ever could without their burst window. So we end up in this really awkward middle ground where the ads matter and they are alive long enough to affect the logs, but because of the movement and just general how Chain Lightning and Earthquake work, it doesn't really work for our damage profile, making us kind of fall short. You can see this specifically on fights like Imperator, the Dragons, and Chimeras. These are exactly the kinds of encounters where other classes can get a lot of extra value out of those ad moments where Elemental is just kind of sort of awkwardly watching them happen. Then on the other side of things, we have the Paladin fight, which is a low target cleave fight and the worst damage profile for Elemental currently. So before we talk about any of the tuning or movements or Stormbringer or anything else, I think this is the first big point. This tier is full of encounters that naturally ask us for the exact kind of damage Elemental is the least comfortable doing. Sure, we have Chain Lightning and Earthquake, but the problem is in these raids that they don't give us clean situations where those are super effective. When the raid needs AoE, it usually happens in these awkward, inconsistent windows where the ads are not stacked perfectly, which effectively makes Earthquake completely useless. So yes, while Elemental does technically have AoE, there is a massive difference between we have AoE buttons and we can actually do AoE damage. This leads me into my second issue causing these numbers, which I believe is Stormbringer itself, because this hero talent setup is much less forgiving in a raid with this much movement. Stormbringer wants stability, it wants you to be planted, and you to be constantly casting. Problem is, this tier doesn't really allow for that. A lot of these fights force constant repositioning in regular moments where you're pulling off of your normal rhythm to move. This is a big issue for Elemental because the spec is already coming into the raid with a bad damage profile fit. So now, on top of having weak low target cleave and awkward answers to infrequent ad waves, you also have a raid environment that makes it much harder to execute the spec cleanly in the first place. Unfortunately, Farseer currently is a thing of the past, so Elemental doesn't have the luxury of a bunch of instant casts like it used to. We really only have Nature's Swiftness and Spirit Walker's Grace. And when you add all these together with the ad spawns, the spread targets, the moments where you would want to otherwise cast Earthquake to maintain pressure, but you can't because it's just wasted Maelstrom, all of those things to kind of compound at once. And that's kind of the gut shot because the movement isn't just lowering Elemental's output by itself, it's amplifying every other weakness that the spec already has in raid. So when you put all that together, the bad logs start to make a lot more sense. We're walking into a raid with awkward cleave, inconsistent ad value, unreliable ground-based AoE, and a movement profile that heavily punishes the way Stormbringer wants to play the game. And this leads us to the two obvious questions, which is how were the tier lists so wrong, and is this just something that'll get fixed with gear? I think the answer is more nuanced. The spec can do good single target damage, and once you start adding those secondary stats, it's obviously going to feel better and those numbers are going to rise. So yeah, it's going to improve with gear. The problem is that those tier list assumptions did not include the issues this raid is specifically exposing. More gear is not going to suddenly turn Elemental into a good low target cleave build. More stats are not going to make the spread damage more reliable or comfortable, and more haste is not going to change the fact that Earthquake is still awkward in these movement heavy fights, or that Stormbringer wants a level of stability that this raid just does not give you. And that's the part a lot of people are going to need to keep in mind when they say Elemental will scale. Sure, Elemental is going to scale, and yes, they do really well with secondary stats, but everyone else will also scale as well. So even if Elemental's output improves, the relative problems will likely stay roughly the same. This is why I don't think it's necessarily an early season gearing issue. Low gear definitely makes it a lot worse right now, and I think that's fair to say, but the underlying problem is that this tier is repeatedly asking for a kind of damage profile and movement tolerance that Elemental just does not naturally bring. So when people ask whether or not these tier lists were wrong, I think the better answer is that they were probably too optimistic about how well Elemental strengths would translate into this specific raid. And that's a very different problem than saying that the spec was overrated across the board, because that's not necessarily true. Elemental getting more stats will definitely help, but it's not going to change the fundamental shape of the problem. But as rough as these first logs are, I still don't necessarily think it's time to fully panic yet. We are still early, there's more tuning passes on the way, gear is coming, and the picture is going to look slightly different a few weeks from now than it does today. I'm not in full doom mode yet, and I definitely think we need more data to be conclusive here. And given that Blizzard has stated that they're going to be doing tuning passes for the next couple of weeks, I do have hope that they're going to help fix this. Well, it happened again. I keep going out of focus because whatever. We got buffs literally an hour after I recorded this video. We got a 20% buff on our Lava Burst, we got a 50% buff on our Elemental Blast and Earth Shock, we got a 10% buff on our Lightning Bolt, Flame Shock, and Voltaic Blaze, equating to roughly a 5% damage buff overall in the raid build. Is this going to make the difference? I don't think so, because we still have the same problems I mentioned throughout the entire video. Is it going to make it feel a little bit better? Sure it will. Honestly, I just want to play Farseer. Blizzard, just make Farseer viable. Let us use it. Let it work with the freaking Apex. You know what? We got buffed. I shouldn't be complaining. Buffs. But at least right now, it's not looking so good. And hey, maybe Blizzard will surprise us. Maybe they'll make Farseer viable and interact with our Apex talents. Imagine that, a class that actually interacts with an expansion-defining system. But until we see that, or the tuning actually addresses the real issues here, I think it's fair to say that Elemental players have a real reason to be nervous about this patch. If you've been raiding with Elemental, let me know your thoughts in the comments below and what your experience has been so far. I'm really curious to hear what you guys are experiencing after the first week of raiding. I also stream my raid over on Twitch every Tuesday and Thursday at 8 PM Eastern, so if you want to watch our progression live, that's the best way to do it. Also, if you want to join the broader conversation, share your own thoughts on the spec, or just hang out with the general community, make sure to join the Discord, links in the description. And of course, for those looking for a more direct way of helping, or just want to support the channel, you can join my Patreon below, where I offer coaching and log reviews. And finally, if you want to keep up to date with the channel, keep up to date with all the WoW coverage coming next, make sure to subscribe and like the video. But that's all I have for today, so thank you very much for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.